Shock news out of Newcastle United this morning as Director of Football Paul Mitchell announced he would be leaving the club by mutual consent at the end of June. I'm here to give my instant reaction to this news on this video, so let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to a very impromptu surprise video. I wasn't planning on doing one today, but before we get into it, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I've got over 1,000 subscribers now. I'm looking to get onto the next stage. A content video is the next planned video, and that'll be out tomorrow, explaining what's happening to the channel over the summer and in the future. But Newcastle United got in the way, and I've come on here just quickly to give my immediate thoughts to the huge news that the Director of Football, Paul Mitchell, will be leaving at the end of June by mutual consent. And in some ways, it's not a surprise at all. If you look at the progression of his career at Newcastle, the fact that there's been no major signings in the last 3 windows, and you could actually say that he will leave the club having not made a major signing because Will Asula was a target from a domestic market and not his doing. This summer, the targets have already been sorted, so it doesn't feel like this is going to impact anything in the immediate term. But how do you pick up the mess of what's happened here, given the context of what also happened at the end of Dan Ashworth's time at Newcastle? And yes, it was reported that he was just leaving for a bigger role at Manchester United, but there were reasons why he was unhappy as well in terms of how much say he had on the role. But there were 2 differences between Mitchell and Ashworth. Ashworth, as I said before, saw himself as the centre of the wheel. Paul Mitchell was very much a 90% recruitment guy. That was what Darren Eales said, and Darren Eales is really crucial to maybe this announcement in a reason that I'll get to in a minute. But he made the point that Mitchell was very much a recruitment guy, and I did a video on this channel last summer saying it made sense in terms of the project because of PSR problems and maybe finding better and different markets across the world. And sort of there was I think Paul Mitchell said last summer about trying to be a little bit more like Brighton and finding gems before they spawn into brilliant players, and Eddie Howe said something similar in his press conference on Sunday afternoon. It never got off the ground. Obviously there was all that speculation immediately of friction between Mitchell and Howe. That never really resolved itself. It sort of they came to a truce. There was lots of talk about collaboration from Eddie Howe's perspective, but there was a difficulty, I think, and Paul Mitchell almost had to apologise for the way he acted and the way he came in last summer without any results to have any say in it. Obviously, we don't know what's fully happened. I'm not sure we'll ever find out what's fully happened, really, in terms of leading why he's going now. But it does feel like to me that Eddie Howe has won a battle of wits. I think that was always the rumour about Dan Ashworth as well. And this is where I would question the logic or the reason for going for another director of football in the same way. Another member of the board. Obviously there's 2 vacancies officially available with Darren Eales going as well, but now Paul Mitchell's going. Whether they'll go and find somebody to oversee the football operations and leave the transfers to Eddie Howe and maybe Steve Nixon, the head of recruitment, that might be a better way to go, because we've seen that Eddie Howe doesn't like somebody encroaching on his the way of working. He has an inner circle of coaches that he worked with. Dan Ashworth wasn't part of that. I don't think Paul Mitchell's ever been part of that either. And we're seeing a lot of domestic transfer targets emerging. Zabarnyi from Bournemouth, Semenyo from Bournemouth, Brian Mbumo, Liam Delap. There seems to be a bit more of a focus on domestic targets, despite obviously interest from abroad. And I don't think it's as cut and dry as domestic targets for Eddie Howe's. Foreign targets are from the mind of Paul Mitchell. That's just not the way it's worked. And obviously there have been great success through Bruno and Tonali and Isak from abroad. So it doesn't mean that all the shopping is going to be done in the Premier League, and that's certainly not the way. I've been very vocal about that. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the summer shapes up. It's all been planned out though already. So this announcement today is not going to have a direct impact on whether the Newcastle's active or how active they are. I don't think that's going to be a big thing. But there is a really interesting quote from Paul Mitchell in his announcement that he said that, Darren Eales is leaving. I've worked with him before, and maybe this is a time for me to go as well. But Darren Eales has been announced to be leaving, obviously, unfortunately suffering with cancer for a long time now, for quite a few months. So why is it only now that this is the case? And it feels like something hasn't been resolved behind the scenes between Howe and Mitchell, and ever since that came in, and we are obviously having the conversations on the flip side last summer when Eddie Howe was the one who was under a bit of pressure because he'd lost an ally in Amanda Staveley in the boardroom and Mehrdad Gadusi as well, and Mitchell was coming in with a remit to maybe shake things up and go in a different direction. Since that's happened, Eddie Howe's won a trophy for Newcastle and got them in the Champions League off the back of no major signings in 3 windows, so no help from Paul Mitchell in that sense. So perhaps the power dynamic has shifted to the point where Eddie Howe is very much in favour, and that is the way to go. I would warn against Eddie Howe having too much say on the way the club is run. Just as a manager, I think in modern day football, that just isn't the done thing. If God forbid it doesn't go well at any point in the future and you sack him and you've got nobody else to sort of give direction to the club, but it's never felt comfortable, has it, with either the director of football. So this is a progression from what happened with Ashworth. When the takeover happened, Newcastle were right in the depths of a relegation battle. They had to hire a manager first, so they went for Eddie Howe and they made that choice first. Usually you would hire the director of football first, who would then input on the head coach, and it would all work a little bit smoother. It hasn't worked like that. Eddie Howe's got a very specific way of working that maybe hasn't gelled particularly well because, as I say, Mitchell is very much scour the kind of lesser markets for youth players and maybe some interesting first team players. Eddie Howe likes certainty. He likes Premier League proven players. I said last year that this felt like it could jar, and I did predict that Eddie Howe wouldn't last the season, but as a result Paul Mitchell's the one who's gone, and maybe that shows a shift in the hierarchy at Newcastle, a shift in who's really been in favour. And when you really think of it like that, Eddie Howe's won a trophy and got them into the Champions League with no major signings made by Paul Mitchell, no major input made by Paul Mitchell, then it's not too hard to really see why that may have happened. But maybe that's a little bit simplistic as well. The other thing that is interesting is James Bunt, performance director, came in as very much a Paul Mitchell hire. He'd worked with him previously. There was a lot of talk about how that was maybe a power shift, but in a sort of very different way to Mitchell and Howe. Howe and Bunt have worked particularly well this season. I think Howe's really been impressed with Bunt's input on injury management. Obviously, I've spoken at length about the no risk approach that they took to Alexander Isak, and that seemed to work really well. The advice that they seem to have a good relationship. So whether that continues, I don't think Paul Mitchell leaving guarantees that James Bunt leaves us by any stretch, but those two were very deeply entwined when they arrived, and it's interesting to see how differently and very publicly Howe has spoken about Bunt in a way that he maybe hasn't spoken about Mitchell. As I say, Mitchell got off to a bad start last summer where he arrived late. It was early July when it happened, and the plans were already in place. He didn't know whether he was coming or going, and there was too much noise around it. And he made that outspoken interview where he said that the transfer policy wasn't fit for purpose, which jarred a lot as well. And since then it's never really fixed itself. It's calmed down, it's quietened down, but it's never really sorted itself out. Whether Newcastle United go for a director of football, I think they'd be silly to go for a director of football immediately, because the same thing would happen. They'd come in late, they wouldn't have an input, there would be a mixed summer. You would threaten that status quo from Eddie Howe. So I would personally look at allowing this summer to progress with how Andy Howe, his nephew, is in the recruitment team. Steve Nixon is the head of recruitment. He's done a very good job. He's got a very good eye for a player as well. So there's enough of a plan in place for this summer. I would certainly, at the very least, look for a replacement for Paul Mitchell at the start of next season. But I don't think that they should be looking for a director of football in the same way, because it just hasn't worked twice now. Two of the very best people out there in terms of reputation have now walked away from Newcastle United early without forming a very strong bond with Eddie Howe. And I think it's very difficult to do that when you come in later than the manager, who's obviously had so much success and has done really well in building the club the way he has. But Ashworth and Mitchell felt like they had very much their egos put out of place by not really getting on a great footing with Eddie Howe. So we'll see what happens next, but shock announcement this morning that Paul Mitchell will leave. It's too early to really say whether he was the right man for the job. This is the problem with the director of football thing. The ownership's been in place for the last 4 years now almost, and it's had 2 directors of football, and neither of them have actually got anything to really prove that they've done a good job or a bad job, because those jobs take a long time to really come to fruition and show the fruits of the labour. So I think it's be very interesting to see what happens in the boardroom next. There's 2 big appointments to make. Certainly they need a CAO before they need a director of football anyway, so I wouldn't imagine that there's going to be a quick resolution to this, but a very surprising announcement this morning. A bit of a shame, as I say, because in some ways, because I liked the promise of what Paul Mitchell was. I still think that they should be scouring lesser markets and going and finding gems, because that's where the value is. I've got lots of videos lined up this summer about sort of potential different markets and players in Europe and across the world who maybe would be a good signing, that sort of thing. But we'll see whether that is going to happen. I don't think you should take it black and white, pardon the pun, that every player who will now sign will be domestic, but it maybe does give credence to the idea. I was asked a few weeks ago about the number of domestic targets compared to the number of targets from abroad, and maybe this is very deliberate and all part of the same thing. But we'll see what happens next. So very surprising news. I didn't see this coming. Thanks so much for joining me though. Like, share and subscribe. Get in the comment section below. What do you think about Paul Mitchell's departure? What do you think the club should do next? And I'll be back this week with a content plan, and then it's full steam ahead for the summer as well. Cheers.